please court?
Yes.
Would you mind introducing yourself to the jury?
Sure, my name is Charlotte Patricia Cochran.
Ms. Cochran, what is your profession?
I currently work in the homicide squad for the city of Atlanta
For how long have you been with the City of Atlanta Police Department?
for 7 years.
And what are your duties as part of your employment?
Well, Atlanta is a big city, so often I'm called to investigate homicides that happen there. Normally the first one on the scene. I gather the evidence and come to conclusions as to what happened.
How are you involved in this case here?
This case, I was the responding investigating detective who was called to the 1522 Moores Mill Road on May 28th.
Tell the jury about your qualifications and your experience.
Well, I first got my BA in criminal justice from Georgia State. After I graduated, I worked as a patrol officer for 5 years. I'm also post-training certified, which means peace officer standards and training. I also have advanced training in crime scene detection, crime scene analysis, as well as firearms and ballistics. So when I'm not investigating homicides in Atlanta, I teach at the FBI Academy ballistics classes.
Let's talk a little bit about that ballistics training. What does that entail?
Well, ballistics is the study of firearms and how they dispel weapons,
What are
or how they dispel bullets, excuse me.
what are some aspects that you, in your training, have been exposed to?
I'm exposed to everything regarding firearms, to the gun itself, to the bullets, to the gunpowder that comes from them, to the way they are, shot into the body or anything like that.
Did your training in ballistics help you in this case?
Absolutely.
Were the principles that you learned in your ballistics training applied to the facts of this case?
Absolutely.
Did you have sufficient facts and data in this case to form any conclusions that you may have formed?
I did form conclusions.
And were those principles and methods that you relied on, would they be relied on by others in your field?
Definitely.
This time, Your Honor, we tender this witness as an expert in the field of ballistics.
Any objection from the defense?
Yes, Your Honor. Defense would like to object to entering Detective Cochran as an expert testimony under Rule 702 because we believe that the detective has a bias being the head of the homicide squad, which has kept her from using reliable principles and methods in the facts of this case.
All right. What says the state on that?
Your Honor, any bias that the detective may have can be explored on cross-examination and is a question for the jury to determine and decide. Therefore, there's no reason to keep her from being an expert in this case.
Okay, any other basis from the defense other than bias grounds that she is a employee of the police department?
Yes, Your Honor. We would also like to object to the fact that detective has only examined 12 suicide cases from all the ones that she has listed, and so therefore, even though she's qualified, she would not necessarily be qualified in this specific instance for examining this situation.
Okay. Any response to that from the state?
Yes, first of all, the detective did not yet testify that she's only examined 12 suicides by gunshot. But, Your Honor, more pertinent is that we're trying to qualify her as an expert in ballistics, not necessarily methods or modes of suicide. The suicides that she has investigated are part of her perception and part of the things that she's experienced as an investigator. But here we're trying to tailor her testimony to things about guns and about firearms that will help the jury to understand the pertinent facts of this case.
Has she testified to the experience, training classes, that kind of thing, in ballistics sufficient that she'd meet the qualifications of Rule 702?
Yes, Your Honor, she says she's testified that she actually teaches firearms training courses for the FBI. Moreover, she's qualified to do that. She has extensive background in ballistics and firearms, has explained what ballistics is, and Your Honor, her testimony could aid the jury in finding facts important in today's case.
Anything else from the defense on this?
Defense would just like to ask that state keep this testimony limited to ballistics as opposed to examination of a suicide
Certainly.
crime scene.
Any I'm gonna overrule the objection and we'll enter her as an expert in the field of ballistics. But her opinions, based on her expertise, need to be limited in scope to ballistics. Anything that is, any other opinions that you seek from her either need more foundation to meet those, whatever that field would be, or need to be based on her lay witness opinion.
Her perception,
Her, her rationally based perceptions, something that a lay witness could give an opinion on. So if you feel like they're getting into an area that crosses the ballistics expertise boundary into something else, then feel free to object to that and we'll take it up at that time.
Thank you.
Okay, so she will be, Detective Cochran will be entered as an expert in the field of ballistics, and you may proceed with your direct examination.
Very good. Detective Cochran, I'd like to take you back to the night of May 28, 2015. What happened that night?
That night, I received a call from dispatch at about 11:35 that a gunshot had occurred at 1522 Moores Mill Road.
Now, is Moores Mill Road, is that in Fulton County?
It is.
Detective Cochran, what did you find when you got there?
Well, I first got there at about 11:05, and I saw that a patrolman had already begun to secure the scene.
Do you know when the patrolman arrived?
I don't know exactly when he arrived, but I would assume that it would be in between the time that we received the call and I arrived at 11:05.
What was the patrolman doing while he was there?
He was putting caution tape around the outside of the house, as well as, looking for any relevant evidence that he might have found outside the home.
Patrol officer was there. Was anybody else present at the scene when you arrived?
Yeah, besides the patrol officer, when I went inside, I noticed Riley Weeks and the defendant.
Where was the defendant specifically?
The defendant was inside the home, near the den area.
And where was Miss Weeks?
She was there as well, with the defendant.
What were they doing?
They were fighting, actually.
How did you dispel the situation?
Well, I didn't want anything else happening. I needed to get in there and I needed to start securing the scene and investigating what had happened. So I immediately told one of the patrol officers who had arrived to escort Miss Weeks out because I intended to interview her later. And then I also told another one of my patrol officers to take the defendant away.
Now, you mentioned the defendant. Is the defendant here in this courtroom today?
He is.
Would you mind identifying him by pointing him out for the jury and describing a piece of clothing he's wearing?
Sure. I see him in that back row right there with a gray hoodie on.
Your Honor, let the record reflect that the witness has successfully and properly identified the defendant as Philip Morris.
The record will so reflect.
Detective Cochran, how did the defendant appear physically when you got there?
When I got there, he appeared to be drunk.
And so you said that you ordered him. What happened when you got there? Did you order him to stay or what?
No, I ordered him to leave because he had bloodshot eyes, he smelled of alcohol, and I didn't want to interview him under those circumstances, so I told another officer to take him down to the station, pump him full of coffee, and then after that would I interview him.
Before you had him leave, did he say anything to you?
He did.
What did he say?
He said the stupid woman shot herself.
Was he talking about his wife?
It seemed that way.
I'd like to discuss your processing of the crime scene now, Detective. Take us through what you saw when you actually came on the scene.
Well, if you were to walk into the Morris home, you kind of walk through a little hallway and you come to the den.
Okay. And what did you find when you left the hallway and came into the den?
When I went to the den, I immediately noticed that there was a wingback chair in the left corner of the room, and in that chair I saw the victim.
Was the victim Sarah Morris?
Yes, upon further identification, it was Sarah Morris.
How was she positioned?
She was kind of slumped over in that chair.
Showing what's been marked as Exhibit X to counsel for defense. May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
You may.
Detective Cochran, what have I just handed you?
This is a photo of Sarah Morris in the den as I found her on May 28th.
Does it fairly and accurately reflect the crime scene or how she was positioned that
Yes.
night?
Mhm.
Does that photo appear to have been doctored or altered in any way in your mind?
No.
Your Honor, this time we move this into evidence that states Exhibit 3.
Any objection to State's Exhibit 3?
No, defense does not have any objections, but we'd like to request that the images of the crime scene be limited to this one.
Okay. Okay, well, if they offer any further beyond this one, we'll take that up.
Okay,
All
thank
right,
you.
without objection, State's Exhibit 3 will be entered into the record.
Thank you, Your Honor. Now, were you able to find a weapon in this case?
I did.
Would you point on this picture where exactly the weapon was?
Sure, so if you look right here to the right side of Sarah Morris, you can find the 38 caliber weapon that I found on the scene to her right side.
Your Honor, I'm showing this one marked as Exhibit Y to counsel for defense. May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
Yes.
Detective Cochran, what have I just handed you?
These are pictures of the right and left side of the 38 caliber revolver that I found on May 28th.
It's the same revolver?
Same revolver.
Now, Detective Cochran, what did you do with this revolver upon finding it at the scene?
I immediately took it into evidence so that I could use it in further testing.
What other tests did you run?
I ran a ballistics test, I ran a fingerprint test.
Where has it been kept in the months leading up to this trial?
It's been in the Atlanta Homicide Department.
Is it under lock and key? the whole time?
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Your Honor, at this time, we move this into evidence as State's Exhibit 4.
Any objection to State's Exhibit 4, a photo of the revolver?
No, Your Honor.
Is it just one photo or both?
It's two
Two
photos
photos of the
same
revolver,
gun.
one on each side.
Yes, Your Honor.
No objection? Okay, without objection, State's Exhibit 4 will be entered into evidence.
Can both of those pictures stand as one exhibit, Your Honor? Is that-
Yes, yes, that is Exhibit 4.
Oh, very good. Now, Detective Cochran, you mentioned you had a test run on the gun.
I did.
Could you take us through the test that you ordered performed?
Sure, I ordered a ballistics test to be performed
Why do you run ballistics tests?
because the ballistics test shows us how the firearm operated when it was fired. We were able to match the bullet as well.
And when you say bullet, what bullet do you mean?
A bullet was recovered from Sarah Morris, and so we were able to determine that that bullet came from this 38 caliber revolver.
Now, what about any other tests that you ran? Did you run any other tests on the
We
gun?
did. We ran a fingerprint test.
Why do you run a fingerprint test?
It's very common in crime scene investigation to take fingerprints of the scene. And so fingerprints allow us to see who, if anybody, handled firearms in this case.
What did the test show in this case?
We did find fingerprints, 2 sets, one from Sarah Morris and one from the defendant.
Let's take Sarah Morris's fingerprints first. Which fingerprint did you find on the gun and where was it?
I found Sarah Morris's fingerprint on the right side of this gun,
Okay.
her index finger.
Okay. Could you point to the jury where exactly you found it?
Yes, it was right in this area on the right side.
Very good. Now, what about the defendant's fingerprint?
I found the defendant's thumbprint on the left side of the gun,
Where?
this area right behind the cylinder.
Okay. Thank you, Detective Cochran. Did you run any more tests, or did you have any other tests? Not necessarily on the gun, but did you have any other tests
Just,
conducted?
yes, I did. Also, a GSR test was conducted.
What does GSR stand for?
It stands for gunshot residue.
What is gunshot residue?
Gunshot residue is basically what is expelled from a gun when it is fired. Gunshot powder or gunpowder is ignited in a firearm and causes the bullet to explode from the gun. So gunshot residue can be expelled in the general area of the firearm and can often get on hands of somebody who's holding it.
So how did you have this test conducted?
We look at the gun and swab the gun, and then we also use that gunpowder residue as a match as to whether or not it's swabbed from, the people who were testing.
Now, who did you test?
Sarah Morris as well as the defendant.
What did the test show for Sarah Morris?
Gunshot residue was found on Sarah Morris's right palm.
And what about the defendant?
It was found on his palm as well as the other side of his hand.
Now, Detective Cochran, were you able, if you could show us the photograph of the body one more time?
Sure.
Were you able to conduct an examination of Sarah Morris as she was there in the chair?
Yes, I did. Without moving the body or anything, I could examine the gunshot wound that's on her right side above her eye.
Okay. I'm gonna ask you some more questions about that in just a moment. But I wanna know first, were you ever able to interview the defendant?
Yeah, I ended up going to the station after I conducted my initial investigation and spoke with him.
What did he have to say?
Well, he had been pumped full of coffee at this point, so I felt a little better about talking to him. And he immediately told me that his wife had put the gun to her head.
Was that his whole story?
Yeah, that was pretty much his whole story until I told him that some of the physical evidence wasn't matching up with what he had told me.
What physical evidence did you tell him about?
Like the stippling, the lack of stippling, which I haven't mentioned yet, but
Well,
that
that's
was one
fine.
of the
Well,
things
let's
I
talk,
told him.
let's talk about it now. What is stippling?
Stippling is a burn that occurs around the outside of a bullet wound.
What are you able to do to identify stippling in just an examination of the body?
Sure, just by the naked eye, you can see stippling. It kind of looks like little black dots around a bullet wound, so you can see it.
Now, if you hold that picture up, was there any stippling on Sarah Morris's body?
No, there was no stippling found around her wound.
How did the defendant react when you told him that there was no stippling?
Well, stippling normally occurs in close gunshot wounds, so that's why I mentioned that to him. So I told him that, and he told me after a long pause, oh, well, it wasn't just like that. She actually held the gun out in front of her head, and he described some method to me of holding it with of Sarah holding the gun with both hands, and pulling the trigger with her 2 thumbs while it was pointed at her.
Did you buy this story?
It just didn't match up with the physical evidence that I had found.
Objection,
What?
personal speculation, this is going to the question that the jury should determine.
Response.
Your Honor, this does not go to the ultimate issue. I'm just simply asking the defendant whether or not her investigation came to the same result the defendant told her.
Overruled.
Did you buy his story, Detective Cochran?
No, I did not personally.
Why not?
Because it just didn't match up with what I found at the crime scene.
Well, let's talk about why what you found at the crime scene didn't point to the defendant's story. What was the first thing that caught your mind?
Well, the first thing is the lack of exit wound in this case.
What's an exit wound, first of all?
Well, just like there's an entrance wound when a bullet enters the body, there's an exit wound when the bullet leaves the body.
When would you expect to find an exit wound?
You would expect to see them in closer range shots. Now, and that all depends on the gun too, though.
Right. What about this gun here? Can you tell us anything about it?
Sure, it's a .38 caliber revolver. It's a basic weapon often used in home defense purposes.
How's it fired?
There are 2 ways to fire this gun, actually.
And what's the first way?
The first way is if you pull back the hammer with your thumb before you fire it. And then if you pull back the hammer, the trigger can be pulled with a very light touch.
What's the second way?
The second way is if you don't pull the hammer back, you have to pull back on the trigger a little bit harder, but then the cylinder comes through and the bullet is fired.
Now, Detective Cochran, is .38 caliber, is that considered small?
Yeah, I mean, it's not the smallest caliber, but it's pretty small, but it is still powerful.
Would you expect a .38 caliber gun to cause an exit wound?
In a suicide situation, absolutely.
Was there an exit wound here?
No.
Could you show the jury one more time the photograph? Where would you have expected to see an exit wound or evidence of an exit wound, if there was one?
Well, you would see maybe some, blood or something on the backside of the chair, indicating that the bullet had exited Sarah's head.
Was there any?
No.
Detective Cochran, may I approach the witness, Your Honor?
Yes.
Showing what's been marked, admitted into evidence as State's Exhibit 1. Detective Cochran, I'm representing you. This is the autopsy that was performed on Sarah Morris. Does that diagram indicate any exit wound at all?
No, it actually says no exit wound.
All right, so we've covered exit wounds. What else led you to your conclusions or further your investigation?
Well, the fingerprints was a big thing that I focused on in
What?
coming to my conclusions.
What about your fingerprint? The fingerprints you found.
Well, although we did find Sarah Morris's fingerprints on the gun, we also found the defendant's, like I said, and the defendant's right thumbprint
Right.
was found on the left side of the gun, right behind the cylinder, which would indicate to me that, that would be right in the position that someone's hand would be if they were firing it.
Now, you've told the jury that you train FBI agents, right,
I do.
in firearms?
Mhm.
Do you show them how to hold weapons?
Absolutely, that's 101.
When you show a person how to hold a weapon who is right-handed,
Mm-hmm.
where does their thumb fall?
Their thumb falls on the left side of the cylinder,
Right where you indicated?
right here, yes.
So what does that, well, let's move on. What other evidence did you find that pointed you in the direction for your investigation?
The lack of stippling,
Okay, you told the jury what stippling is.
Mhm.
Why did this trouble you?
because that means that, based on the physical evidence, Sarah Morris would have had to have been shot at a distance.
Does that match up with what the defendant says?
No, he indicated that she pointed the gun at herself and shot herself.
Would you have expected to find stippling?
Yes,
And just remind us, there was no stippling, was there?
there was no stippling found.
What else, Detective Cochran? Keep going.
Just the position of the wound in general was odd to me.
Why is that?
Well, I have investigated plenty of suicides in my time at Atlanta police.
How many of those were by gunshot?
Just 12 by gunshot.
Okay. And when you investigate those suicides by gunshot, where do you usually find the wounds?
Typically, from what I've seen, suicide by gunshot wounds are found under the chin, in the temple, or sometimes even in the mouth.
Where was the gunshot wound in this case?
It was on Sarah's right side above her eyebrow and her forehead.
Have you ever seen a suicide committed in this manner?
I have never seen that, no.
Now, Detective Cochran, is there anything else?
Yeah, the position of the gun was odd to me as well.
What was odd about that?
Well, if Sarah Morris had fired the gun in the way that the defendant had said she did, then the gun would have recoiled, and it would have been found somewhere in front of Sarah instead of to the side of her.
Where, could you point on the picture where exactly the gun was found?
Sure, I found the gun over on the right side. I would have thought it would have been somewhere in this area.
Well, Detective Cochran, is there anything else you can add?
Yeah, one more thing would be the gunshot residue.
Okay. What about that?
Well, I found it on Sarah Morris's right palm, but then I also found it on the defendant's right palm as well as the other side of his right hand.
Why was this important to you?
Because that indicated to me that the defendant had been the one to fire the gun.
Detective Cochran, do you think suicide happened here?
I do not.
Thank you. Nothing further.
Any cross-examination?
Yes, Your Honor.
You may proceed.
Permission to approach the witness.
Yes.
Detective Cochran, were you the officer who responded to the phone call about Sarah Morris's death on May 28, 2013?
Yes,
And you received this call at 10:35 p.m. that night,
that is correct.
and you were dispatched at 10:40 p.m.
Correct.
So you arrived at Sarah Morris's house after this at 11:05 p.m.
Correct.
So it took you 30 minutes to get to the house after the phone call.
It did take me 30 minutes. When I got there, there was a patrolman there securing the scene.
And also, once you got to the house, there was two other people, Philip Morris and Riley Weeks.
Correct.
And you had mentioned that there was some bickering going on between them.
There was.
And once you got there and started looking around and you saw their bickering, you broke up the argument.
Correct.
And once you broke up this argument, then you told Riley Weeks to leave the scene. You instructed other officers to take him from the scene.
Correct. I intended to interview Riley after she left, so the officer took her.
But this was before you had fully examined the scene.
Fully examined the scene, correct.
And you knew that there had just been a death at the scene, according to the phone call.
Correct.
And Riley Weeks and Philip Morris were supposedly the only people at the scene before the other officers arrived.
Yes.
And so you let Riley Weeks go, but then for Philip Morris, did you let him go to the office immediately, the police department?
Yeah, he was drunk and I didn't want to interview him that way, so he went down to the office so I could interview him later.
Later, so then you had transported him later.
He went at that time and then I was going to interview him later.
And so you were processing the scene.
That is true.
You found the gun that was used,
Yes.
and it was a .38 caliber revolver.
Yes.
And you mentioned this gun had Sarah's fingerprints on it.
It did.
And it was one left index fingerprint on the right side of the barrel.
Correct.
And you also did a nitrate test.
I did.
And this showed that both Sarah and Philip had gunpowder residue.
Yeah, Sarah had it on her right palm, but it was more odd to me that the defendant had it on his right palm as well as the right side of his hand.
And so you mentioned how gunpowder residue works, that it only gets on a person after the gun has gone off.
It can, but it can also stay on a gun that has been fired, previously.
But that's usually what the test is conducted for, to determine if it was held after a gun went off.
Or during when a gun's being fired, correct?
And you said that Sarah's right hand was positive for gunpowder residue,
It was.
just to confirm. Yeah. But then, so also, is it true for gunpowder residue tests, it doesn't necessarily mean that a person did not touch the gun if the test comes out negative?
Objection, Your Honor, it's a confusing question.
Sorry, let me
Rephrase
rephrase
it, yeah.
If the gunpowder test comes out positive, that indicates a person has held the gun at the time it went off or after.
Yes, it can indicate that. As I said, though, gunpowder residue can stay on a gun, and the fact that the defendant had it on his palm as well as the outside of his hand alerted me to the fact that he was the one who most likely fired it.
So, also to just draw from that, if the gunpowder test comes out negative, does that mean the person definitely did not touch the gun?
I cannot conclude whether something would definitely happen. I'm not sure how to
So
answer
it's
that.
not a conclusive test.
It doesn't have to be conclusive, no.
And
I mean, in this case, I did use it in coming to a conclusion, but doesn't have to be the only thing that you look at.
And so you examined, also just to continue from there, you examined Sarah Morris.
Yeah.
And you saw there was a gun wound right over her right eye.
That's correct.
And you said that you've seen wounds from a suicide killing before?
I've seen multiple suicides, 12 specifically by gunshot.
So you've only investigated 12 suicides, is that correct?
That is correct, by gunshot.
And so from these 12 suicides, has the victim ever shot from anywhere other than directly above the temple, under the chin, or in the mouth?
I'm a little confused by your question, but in the 12 suicides I've seen, I've normally seen the wounds under the chin, in the temple, or in the mouth. That is correct.
So you've never examined a suicide killing from somebody holding the gun out in front of them at a distance?
I've not seen that.
And are you aware how far the gun was held according to Philip Morris's testimony, or at the police department?
I'm not sure of that, no.
So you're saying you don't know what Philip Morris said as far as how far the gun was?
He told me that it was out in front of her head.
Okay, yeah. And how far does the gun have to be to cause stippling, you said?
They have to be in close range.
Okay, and then you're aware that, like you said, that Philip said that Sarah was holding the gun at a distance.
Correct, yeah, about arm's length distance.
So if the gun was fired from such distance, would it not be possible that it would not cause stippling that way?
It is unlikely.
And it would be possible that the bullet would not cause an exit wound from such distance?
If the defendant was telling the truth as to the story, there would, I'm sorry, I'm confused by your question. Can you repeat that?
Yeah, let me clarify. So if Sarah Morris was indeed holding the gun where Philip Morris said, at a distance of arm's length, about 14 inches, would it not be possible that an exit wound wouldn't come from that?
I mean, I guess it would be possible, but that's not really what the physical evidence was in this case.
And so with how Sarah was at the time, was she sitting down?
She was sitting, yeah.
And like you said, the gun was alleged to be held at a distance by Philip.
Correct.
So would it not be possible that the gun, upon falling, would hit her knees before hitting the ground?
That's possible, but it would be more likely that the gun, if it matched up with what he had told me, would have recoiled out into the carpet.
And were you told if Sarah was suffering from depression at this time?
I do not believe I was told that.
So you weren't aware that?
I mean, I'm aware of it now, yes, during my investigation, but the defendant didn't tell me that.
That's all the questions, Your Honor.
Okay, any redirect by the state?
Yes, Your Honor. Detective Cochran, was it Riley Weeks ever considered a suspect?
I mean, everyone, when you arrive on the scene, is a suspect until you can narrow them out. So I left, Riley Weeks left with an officer. I intended to interview her later, just like the defendant left with an officer, and I intended to interview him later.
Did you ever interview Riley Weeks?
I did.
What did she say?
She told me that the defendant and Sarah Morris were fighting like they do a lot, and she heard a gunshot and went over.
Was she considered a suspect after your interview?
Once I saw the physical evidence, no.
Thank you. Nothing further.
All right, witness may step down. Does the state have any further witnesses it wishes to call?
Your Honor, before we proceed, may I publish this evidence to the jury, please?
Yes.
May I consider it constructively published?
Yes, it will be published to the jury. You can place it with the court.
And Your Honor, we do have another witness at this time. The state calls Riley Weeks to the stand.
Okay. You may proceed.
Mrs. Weeks, if you would, please introduce yourself to the jury.
Hello, I'm Riley Weeks.
Mrs. Weeks, what do you do for a living?
I'm retired.
You're retired. Well, what did you do for a living?
I was a librarian for several years at an elementary school.
Are you married, Mrs. Weeks?
Yes.
And how long have you been married?
My husband Patrick and I will actually be married 50 years next May.
Congratulations. Mrs. Weeks, where do you live?
I live on Moores Mill Road.
And if you would, tell us how you're connected to this case.
Well, I actually live right next door to the Morris's home, Philip and Sarah Morris.
How long had you known Sarah Morris before she died?
I've known Sarah since she was a little girl. Sarah grew up in the house where she and Philip were living, and we were her next door neighbors almost her entire life, so I know her for a really long time.
And what were Sarah's parents' names?
Cindy and Taylor?
Cindy and Taylor. How was your relationship with Sarah's parents?
It was great. We were very, very close. They welcomed us as soon as we moved in next door, and we were friends ever since.
Tell us a little bit about the relationship that you personally had with Sarah.
With Sarah, she was a little girl when I first met her, but we felt very close. We went to Sarah's ballet recitals, and when she graduated from college, we went very close to Sarah.
From your own personal knowledge, what kind of relationship did Sarah have with her parents?
Well, like I said, we were close to Sarah, but we were friends with her parents. We got to see a lot of them together. Sarah was an only child, so they were rather close.
Mrs. Weeks, tell us what happened to Sarah's parents in 2012.
In 2012, Sarah's parents died in a very tragic car accident.
As far as you could tell, what effect did this car accident have on Sarah?
hard on everyone, but it was very difficult for her. Sarah struggled with the loss of her parents.
Were you able to talk to Sarah very much after her parents passed away?
I tried. After the loss of her parents, Sarah ended up moving back into her family home right next door. So I go over there from time to time and invite her over to my house for dinner with me and my husband. And Sarah would have normally come over immediately, drop whatever she was doing, but Sarah wouldn't want to leave the house at all after her parents' death.
And that wasn't typical of Sarah?
No, not at all. Sarah was a happy person before her parents' death, very outgoing, caring, and then she just became very withdrawn afterwards.
Let me ask you this, Mrs. Weeks. Do you know the defendant in today's case?
I do.
How long have you known him?
A few years.
When did you first meet Philip Morris?
I met Philip in 2013, right after Sarah filed a lawsuit against the trucking company that hit and killed her parents. Philip showed up right about the same time all that hit the media.
Where was Philip living at that point?
He wasn't living next door then. They moved in together after they got married.
And remind us, when did they get married?
They got married in 2014 at around Christmas time.
Now, just to be clear, before Sarah's parents died, have you ever seen the defendant before?
No.
Mrs. Weeks, from what you could tell as the next door neighbor, what kind of relationship did the defendant and Sarah have?
It was not a good relationship at all.
Why do you say that?
Well, I saw and heard a lot of things that were just awful. The way Philip treated Sarah, the way they argued constantly, night after night, yelling, screaming, throwing things. It was terrible.
Tell us, Mrs. Weeks, how close is your house to the house that Sarah and the defendant were living in?
Very close. Our houses are separated by a driveway. That's how I heard and saw all of this stuff happening.
How far, I mean, a driveway, there's big driveways or smaller driveways. How far exactly are the two
Small
houses?
driveway, just big enough for a car to get down it. And my bedroom, if you're looking at the two homes from the street, I guess is the best way to explain it. Our house is to the left and my bedroom is on the right side of the house, closest to their home.
Based on that, Mrs. Weeks, how well could you hear things that were said inside the Morris's home?
Pretty well. I heard some yelling, screaming, some awful language, and lots of threats.
Mrs. Weeks, did Sarah ever reach out to you for help?
She did. And, you know, looking back on it, the things that I heard and saw, I wanted to mind my own business. And I only wish now that I had done more.
So you say she reached out to you for help. When was that?
It was several times that Sarah showed up at my door. But I believe the first time was in mid-March of 2015. Yeah, mid-March.
What time did she show up at your door?
11:30 p.m., late at night. She was in her pajamas.
Could you describe her appearance besides what she was wearing when she showed up at your door that night?
Sarah was just in an emotional state. She was a wreck. She was very flustered, sobbing, crying. She had a busted lip, and she was breathing so heavily. It was kind of hard to understand her at first.
You said she had a busted lip. Do you know how she busted her lip?
Judge and speculation.
If she knows, she knows, and then we'll get into that, so overruled for now.
Mrs. Weeks, do you know how Sarah's lip was busted that night?
Well, like I said, Sarah showed up in this very emotional state and told her to come into my home, and told me that Philip had hit her in the face and even threatened to kill her. That's why she was
Objection, hearsay.
there.
Response?
Your Honor, while this is an out-of-court statement being offered for the truth of the matter asserted, it falls under the hearsay exception of excited utterance. The witnesses laid foundation that the declarant was, before I go any further, can we assume that we're outside the purpose of the
Yes.
jury?
Thank you.
The witness has laid foundation that that the declarant showed up at her doorstep, terrified, in a hysterical fit, trembling, shaking. For that reason, anything that the declarant says in that excited state falls under the excited utterance exception to hearsay.
A response?
No, Your Honor.
All right, I'm gonna overrule that objection. You can proceed.
So Mrs. Weeks, what did Sarah tell you that night when she showed up?
She told me that Philip had hit her. That's where the busted lip came from, and that he'd even threatened to kill her.
Mrs. Weeks, besides that night, did Sarah reach out to you any other times?
The same week that she passed away, Sarah showed up at my home. It was the day after Memorial Day. Again, late at night, just completely terrified. I'll never forget how scared and vulnerable she looked. Again, just sobbing hysterically, barely getting words out.
When you talked to her that night, what did you say?
Objection, hearsay?
Response?
Your Honor, again, outside the presence of the jury, the witness is about to go into what Sarah told her, which is that she was depressed about her parents' death and about her marriage to Philip. With that being said, that would fall under the then existing mental and emotional condition exception to hearsay, because it goes to her depression at the time, how she was feeling, and obviously this is relevant as it's 2 days before her death.
Anything from the defense on that?
No.
Lay a little more foundation for how she knows that the testimony so far is she showed up and she's gonna tell me X. Let's lay a little foundation on why it's an existing mental or emotional condition before you delve into the specific statements.
Yes, Your Honor.
So overruled for now, but let's lay that foundation first.
Okay. Mrs. Weeks, on May 26th, when Sarah Morris showed up at your door again, what condition was she in?
Terrified. She looked scared, sad, very sad. She was sobbing, crying, very emotional, and just overwhelmed.
From what you could personally observe, was she coming to talk to you about being terrified?
Yes, she wanted to come inside very desperately. She wanted to come in. Our house has always been a safe haven for her. It was very much like the last time she showed up at my home.
So, Mrs. Weeks, what did Sarah say to you when she showed up on May 26th?
Sarah confided in me that she was worried Philip was going to kill her. If she died, it would be because of Philip.
Mrs. Weeks, let's turn now to 2 days after that incident. Of course, the date of Sarah's death. Can you describe to us what you heard on the night of May 28th, 2015?
Yeah, it was like most nights. Around 9 p.m., I heard the two of them arguing, Philip and Sarah, yelling, screaming, going things, and this went on for over an hour, just the yelling and screaming, and then for just a little while, not long at all, it got quiet, very quiet, and then that's when I heard a loud bang.
So just to back up a little bit, you heard the argument start at 9,
Yeah.
and you said it lasted for over an hour,
Mhm.
so past 10 p.m., is that right?
Yes.
How long did the silence last between the end of the argument and when you heard the loud bang?
I can't be sure, but it wasn't long at all.
After you heard the loud bang, what did you do, Mrs. Weeks?
I left. I ran right next door. I was so worried for Sarah. All the things that before I had tried to ignore because I felt like that's what she wanted me to do were just all rushing back to me. All the time she showed up at my doorstep, so upset about Philip. I took off and ran next door. I wanted to help her.
Mrs. Weeks, if you were so concerned about Sarah, why didn't you call the police?
I just didn't think about it. Didn't think about it at all. I cared a lot about Sarah, and I thought the worst and thought I could just get over there, I could help, and looking back on it, I know it wasn't probably the safest or the wisest decision, but in that moment, that's what I did.
Mrs. Weeks, what happened when you got next door?
Got next door, I was knocking on the door practically, trying to beat it down to get inside because Philip wouldn't answer. I could hear him in the house moving around, but he wouldn't answer the door, and I must have stood there knocking. It felt like forever.
When someone finally came to the door, what happened?
Well, Philip finally answered and let me in, but as he did that, he told me pretty much right away that Sarah had shot herself.
What did you do at that point?
I pushed right past him, went in the house looking for her, and I found her pretty much right away in the den.
What did Sarah look like when you found her?
Sarah was actually, she was sitting in this wingback chair that I'd seen her sit in with her dad 100 times when she was little, reading books. But this time, she's sitting there, and Sarah slumped over in the chair with a gunshot wound to her head.
Mrs. Weeks, on that night in that room when you found Sarah, what was the defendant doing at that time?
Oh, he walked right in. I'll never forget it, and just sat down on the couch right across from her and stared at her. No crying, no emotion, just sat there.
Thank you for your time, Mrs. Weeks. That's all the questions I have. Please answer any questions that opposing counsel has for you.
Any cross-examination?
Yes, Your Honor. So, Ms. Weeks, you say you kept a close eye on Miss Morris, correct? On Sarah?
I don't know if I said that today, but I believe that would be correct. I mean, I tried to look out for her.
So much so that Mr. Morris caught you looking into their home with binoculars, correct?
Excuse me?
Mr. Morris says that he told you that he caught you looking into their house with binoculars.
No, ma'am, that never happened.
You hated Philip from the beginning, though, correct?
Excuse me?
You disliked Philip Morris.
I didn't care for Philip that much, but I especially didn't care for him after he beat and abused Sarah on several occasions. I wouldn't like anyone who hit someone that I felt was so close to me, like practically family.
And in your statement to Detective Cochran, you portrayed that, and you even called Mr. Morris an SOB. Is that correct?
Just the letters. I would never actually say what those stand for, but you have to remember, man, I gave that statement the next morning after Sarah had passed away. I was still very upset about her death.
So you just testified that your home was a safe haven for Sarah Morris. Is that correct?
I tried really hard to make it that way. Yes.
But she barely came over to you after her parents died when she was going through depression, correct?
After her parents died, I would go over there to check on Sarah. And then, yeah, when Philip came into the picture, it got even worse. She didn't visit me. She didn't visit any of her friends anymore.
But she hadn't
left the
visited
home
you.
even
I'm
less.
sorry. But she didn't visit you before Philip came either, though, correct?
No, after her parents' death. Now, before that, we saw Sarah an awful lot.
Correct. And let's talk about the night of May 26th when she did come over to see you. She told you that night that she was depressed about her parents as well, right? And couldn't go on.
Yes, I believe I do remember her saying she was depressed about her parents and that she couldn't go on in her marriage.
And then fast forward to 2 nights later, the tragic night that Sarah Morris was killed. You said you heard Sarah and Philip arguing, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And if she supposedly told you this 2 nights prior that her life was in danger and allegedly told you that Philip was gonna take her life, why would you continue to let that argue go on, correct? You didn't go intervene even though she had just told you that she was worried about Philip killing her.
No, I didn't, and I regret it every day, because if I had gone over there, he might not have shot her. But I tried really hard not to just jump into their marriage, and man, they fought like this 100 times before.
But just 2 nights before, she said that, allegedly said to you that he was gonna kill her, correct?
Yes, she told me that if she died, it would be because of Philip, and look at where we are now.
And then 2 nights later, when the fighting was going on, you still didn't go over there when the fighting began, correct? Or call the cops?
Ma'am, 2 nights later, she was dead, and the only other person in that house with her was her husband.
So when you heard the loud bang, you ran directly over to the house, correct?
Yes, of course.
But you had believed Sarah when she said that Philip was dangerous and was gonna hurt her.
Yes,
And you ran directly into a house where you're saying you believed he killed her.
yes.
You
I'm
didn't
not saying it was the wisest decision, but it's what I did.
And you didn't call the police.
No, when I got there, like I said, Philip let me in. I found Sarah, and he sat down. And at some point, he told me that he'd call the police, and that's when I decided to just stay and wait.
No further questions, Your Honor.
All right, any redirect?
No redirect, Your Honor.
Does the defense have any, witness may be excused, does the defense have any witnesses, or state have any witnesses it wishes to call?
No, Your Honor, we've called all the witnesses that we have in the state rests.
Okay. Anything from the defense before we begin the defense case in chief?
Can we request a recess?
Sure.